just came up with I guess, a more simplified way of talking about these things. So both the borderline species of psychopathology and the narcissistic species of psychopathology, I would say, are both reacting to their own inferior function as a projection onto the environment. But it does make a big difference in that, in some sense, the borderline is consciously projecting a negative onto other people. In some sense, the borderline is acting as if other people are impinging on their, are projecting against their inferior function, and they are reacting to other people's projection onto their inferior function. Whereas the narcissist is overtly dealing with an introjective paradigm and an introjective sort of introjective objects, which is just the kind of, well, that's the natural atmosphere that the narcissist lives in. That's the natural state of the structure of the psyche, is that everyone falls under the purview of this kind of detached inferior function in their ego, which is even detached from themselves, but which is the kind of the friendly version of themselves as the dungeon master, as a kind of as a god figure or something like that. So usually it shares the likeness, it's in the image of the likeness of the narcissist or something like that. But in some sense, both of these projections, what they do is they, although again, it's difficult to conflate narcissism and borderline because they're so different, because in some sense the narcissist is completely detached from what I would call the recursive circuitry because they are not stepping into their unconscious inferior function and sin, and they're not touching, which is at the same time their ego function, death, and child function. So they're not touching their ego function, child function, and death, and then they're also negating or skipping over their dominant function and parent function in their ego. So they are completely unconscious focused in terms of their unconscious dominant and parent function is essentially as high as they go in terms of development. And then all that recursive circuitry is essentially mitigated or compacted into a kind of the matrix of their ego inferior function, which is kind of like the sort of the kind of like a god figure or something like that, or it's a kind of it's a weird kind of moral sort of thing. Inception. It's kind of like a world inception. It's the god of the world or something like that. So they've got access to an internal purview over a god's eye perspective, a god's eye point of view. Now, the borderline is doing this in reverse in some sense, because in some sense you could argue that the narcissist is a victim of their own structure, their own schema in this way, that they've kind of developed it. And often I would even say that they've developed it probably ontologically as a response in early childhood to some kind of, very uh, a form of abuse, a form of, and usually abuse that is in the style of the borderline. It's usually, essentially a female caregiver that is overtly a kind of borderline sort of psychopath, which I still don't understand why we should even call them secondary psychopaths. In some sense, it's just in some sense, I almost see, again, anyway, there's a lot more conscientiousness because it's coming from the ego. The borderline form of pathology is a completely conscientious program, and the only way that it looks like it's a victim of its own programming is that essentially, because what would be the narcissistic strength in the borderline is the fall guy, because essentially the identity dysphoria and things like that, which borderlines are going through, are just there because they are preserving the sanctity of their recursive circuitry, which is becoming a primary circuitry, and then what would be the other side of the fence, the narcissistic sort of basis in a normal narcissistic case, becomes a sympathetic circuit to the borderline's primary circuitry, which is the recursive circuitry. So they're doing it in reverse. They're doing their circuitry in reverse, and that means that they have to sort of post hoc confabulate. But when they post hoc confabulate, uh, because essentially the only sediment that it's based on is a negative projection, a shadow projection, that other people are encroaching on their inferior function, reality is based under the accusation against others. Essentially, that reality is only anchored in as much as other people are willing to shoulder the accountability and responsibility for the fate of the borderline. So this is how borderline functions. It's a kind of accountability parasite. It's exactly what fascism is in ideological, political terms. It's that, oh, it's the systemic oppression. It's never me. It's never, you never take responsibility for your own fate. It's collectivized. It's projected onto the objective sort of narrative or something like that. Anyway, so they're both, but in some they share this, is that they're both projections on the inferior function, or from the inferior function onto an introjective paradigm in some sense. So in that way you can lump them together, but it is different because the narcissistic projection is a positive projection as what is happening. Therefore they maintain an internal locus of control in that it actually makes sense relative to their unconscious dominant function, is actually knows what's going on, whereas the borderline also has an unconscious dominant function, but it's not rooted in the unconscious ontological process, the electrical sort of circuitry from the bottom. It's rooted into the top, into the means are justified by the ends. It's a reverse formulaic. So they already have the conclusion. The conclusion is foregone, and then they are willing to confabulate whatever grounds it, essentially post hoc. So they're always begging the question, essentially. It's fundamentally a bad faith way of operating, way of purviewing reality and seeing the world, and these sorts of things. And so when they have already normalized that formulaic interface, essentially, as I said, the only way that you could ever fix them is if you get them in that private juncture when they are communing with when they're grounding their own sort of hybridized borderline personality disorder ideology in the knowledge of evil, because it's only when they are essentially re-establishing or reviewing their the ego inferior function projection onto other people, the negative projection, because I call it a negative projection because the projection is that other people are encroaching on their inferior function. So the idea is that other people are putting impositions onto their inferior function. That is what they're projecting. They're projecting that other people are perpetrating things against them. It's a complete victim mentality, and this is, I mean, you see this with borderlines. This is why there are false rape allegations all the time. This is why women have famously been prone to making false rape accusations. Not women, every single woman, but in general, it's known that women will make false accusations because this is a borderline defense mechanism. Because if someone has made you feel less than, then it's perfectly reasonable in the borderline psyche to justify escalation by concocting a negative projection, because one that will reflect environmentally the same gravitas in how they feel uh, uh, dethroned or sort of or lambasted or something like that. So whatever they have been negatively, whatever slight that has occurred, in their sort of devouring mother, sort of ethos, they are given every uh, sort of internal justification to elaborate. I mean, in some sense, as long as they can get away with it, in some sense, they are very, very crafty at knowing, at seizing on ambiguity. It's the kind of manipulation. You see this in ENFJs particularly. Um, anyway. Uh, what am I talking about? So, and in some sense, the borderline gets away with this mostly because they suffer through their own melodrama. They are fine with using, in some sense, the narcissistic component, which is being dragged along for the ride. It doesn't matter if that's being dragged through the mud, so long as that they can control the environment, because they're more they're more fixated and obsessed with projecting a negative attribution that is in some sense reacting or corresponding or sort of in this codependent drama with their inferior function, because for them it's more important that their inferior function becomes the central nexus of reality. That is, and as soon as you understand that that's how borderline operates, everything makes sense, because it doesn't matter that they are costing themselves, it doesn't matter that they are hurting themselves, it doesn't matter what they have to go through, as long as that inferior function projection has a stable codependency around it. They will do whatever it takes in order to engineer a stable codependency with that inferior function projection. In the same way, narcissists will also um, concoct narcissistic injury in order to ground their inferior function, because people need to correspond with their ego in some way, and if they don't have this special exploitation where they are reacting to their own inferior function that's being projected in some sense into some introjective paradigm. Although, as I said, with the borderline, it's very different to the narcissist, because the narcissist, in some sense, can do it privately. A narcissist could do this privately. I mean, obviously, they won't be able to mask it perfectly and disguise it or whatever. But a narcissist could do it in a more stable sense. They could do it in a more atomized sort of way, potentially, at least. I mean, in practice, they won't stick within their own lines of their own game, whatever. But the borderline is incredibly messy. The borderline only functions by getting into the mind of their audience, getting into the mind of their host, of their victim, in some sense, of their codependent sort of chattel that's part of this sustaining this narrative. In some sense, without a sadistically edged, excoriating sort of I mean, this is why, for instance, they can often mimic very, very reasonable interaction. They can actually they can, as like a chimera, they can for a time seem very, very stable, very, very put together, and very, very concrete. But this is always a transient sort of honeymoon phase where they are trying to attract a high status or a kind of useful butler or henchman or something like that. And eventually what they do is they start off on a high note to hook someone, and then they basically degrade them, and they get into this sort of attrition. And eventually what they do is they swap roles, and they say, you were always degrading me, and I'm the victim and you are the perpetrator. And they will kind of switch positions after sort of forcing the other person to follow their internalized bullshit, their internalized narrative, and take responsibility for this subjective projection of the borderline for their internalized narrative. So they'll generally get into these sorts of disgusting sort of parasitic extractions where they'll be like, well, you gave me this impression, you made me adopt this point of view, and now I have acted in my own detriment because you misled me, so therefore you must pay for what was foregone, or what what I expected to get and what wasn't delivered is now all on you. And so they play this trick where essentially they extract someone to be the guarantor of their expectation. And they play this game until they have essentially habituated and decompartmentalized the moral. In some sense, this trick only works if their host has a pretense of normative morality and a pretense of normative ethics. Because if someone doesn't follow rules, then they cannot be exploited by the borderline, because the borderline will map the rules and then they will inject just the right amount of ambiguity, just the right amount of nebulousness in order to exploit the system that is being created for them to interface with. And they will often, usually people that are half clever that have sophisticated systems and rules, can't be exploited within certain bounds. Eventually they'll run out of rope, essentially. But then what the borderline will do is the borderline will concoct social drama. They will plug into social conventions, they will exploit social pressure, essentially. They will use social manipulation to engineer their um, their entrenched position, and in some sense then you'll be stuck between a rock and a hard place. And this is the famous story of the battered woman. Not every battered woman, but many battered women are borderline cases. These are women that are themselves incredibly toxic, incredibly abusive in their own psychological way. And what they have done is they have decompartmentalized the men that they have parasitically attached themselves to, and they have extracted beatings out of those men in order to create a melodrama that justifies their pristine, sacred victimhood, essentially. Um, and in some sense, it's a it's a recurring motif. It's a disgusting sort of thing, and it's a testament to how borderlines and narcissists often find each other. Um, and in some sense, there is a version of this in most even heterosexual dynamics that have to do with essentially disintegrated or un essentially, I mean, this has to do with the hermetic alchemical process of actually properly developing one's own inferior function in the ego, and essentially amalgamating the either the anima or the animus or whatever, um, into a unified, holistic inferior function that is properly representative of one's own recursive circuitry in some sense, and that is related to the self, that is not projected onto other people, but that you are taking responsibility for internally, with an internal locus of control, which in some sense does require connecting it ontologically with the superego, with the thing that began before the subconscious, um, which the ego, especially through the inferior function of the ego, does show when you actually develop that, and when you've done the requisite shadow work. It can at the very least see the outline of it. You cannot not see the outline of the superego. It is perfectly compacted into the inferior function. Now, sorry, I wanted to say this, that in some sense, therefore, people who are borderline, you can get a decent flavor of their superego, even, um, to some degree. It's representative in the projection. Every time I say that, it's true, but it's not true. It's true in a weird sort of way. It's true in terms of the volume. It's not true in terms of maybe the substance. So, but what's weird is that the narcissistic sort of in some sense, the problem with natural narcissists is that they were never given the leeway to explore and electrically develop circuitry towards their own inferior function, because they just didn't have the protective bubble. They didn't have enough of a naive narcissistic phase to naturally develop recursive circuitry that didn't just become it's as if they kind of took some crib notes in sort of in watched adults or watched other people in the world and just kind of developed a shortcut to adulthood. Because they felt so hard pressed by their environment that, or something like, or that's the external locus of control, that they would have to just see what their inferior function says about their environment directly, so that they could correspond with their environment immediately, or something like that. And in some sense, that's half of the story. That's not the whole story. The other half of the story is that perhaps they just had a very deep connection with their subconscious dominant function and they just never wanted to let it go. And they were looking for an excuse in order to entrench it. And so then they develop a kind of a hard done by. I've been hard done by my environment. I can't develop recursive circuitry. I mean, this is narcissists aren't necessarily hard on themselves in this way. They don't create soliloquies. They don't create sort of sympathy stories. Um, but in some sense, I do think that it might have to do with revulsion to something like the mature feminine. I do think that it's very hard to develop. Very few people are in Keegan stage 4, for instance, to use the Keegan stage model. And the reason why that is because, um, I mean, I would generally link it thematically. I would tie that in with the hermetical alchemical process of integrating the feminine and the masculine, integration with the shadow, or whatever, with the anima and the animus. And that the reason why that is not done by people is because generally, I mean, you could blame it on the general health of culture to some degree, but it also happens in every generation. It happens within individual psyches where people work out that the narcissistic strategy is a winning strategy, because you become like a turtle. You become like, you have a shell and it's protective. And if you use, and if culturally that shell is respected, if it is um, essentially, if you don't have good role models that show you individuation and show you what you're missing out on, And when the culture has sort of normalized, um, in some sense, when there's so much ideological nonsense going around, and feminism and ideology and narratives of systemic oppression, the only way that you can kind of weather that kind of terrorism, that kind of sexuality is under siege in some sense, because now sexuality is held by the ideology, is held in the reins of this. You can't have an individual sexuality because you might misgender someone or you might refer to someone incorrectly. So there's so much sort of delusional nonsense and sort of and booby traps and things like that to get with these different sort of programs. The only way to safely even interact in that kind of toxic environment, um, is, I would say, to revert into a kind of reflexive narcissism. And I would even say that the kind of ADHD which I've sometimes mentioned but not spoken of with any great sort of intelligence on that matter. But I think that what ADHD is it's a bit of both. It's a bit of narcissism and borderline personality disorder. It, I think. I think it's a kind of, it's a Keegan stage 3.5 kind of schism in which there is a partition that protects a kind of narcissistic basis, and then there is a kind of ego. There is some ego development that isn't doing a reverse. It isn't doing a reverse. It isn't making the narcissistic thing a kind of sympathetic circuit to it. But there is a kind of. It's hard to get them to be in lockstep with each other. It's hard to get them to move in the same. So you've got kind of two different. You've got a motivational module in the narcissistic component, and you've got a kind of technical awareness in the borderline sort of components, although it's probably not even close to borderline. It's closer to probably my model of cerebral histrionic. And so essentially that's what the ADHD is that they are being histrionic about what they are cerebrally interested in and invested into, in terms of that it has to be on par with the kind of. So it's weird because I think that they have developed the capacity, like a borderline would, to project onto people and to project impositions against them. They have that as a capacity. They don't use it against people, but they have it as a capacity. And I think that they've almost culturally imbibed this capacity. They have modeled it, other people doing it. They have seen that it is part of the zeitgeist, as part of the way of the world. They've picked it up as a skill and they have imprinted on it. They have developed it internally, but they don't use it. They use it as a kind of technical way of parsing data and information and knowledge. So they've actually been imprinted on by a sick political ideological sort of culture. They have, it's like, I mean, this is what children do, is they imprint on things. They say, oh, that's my role model, I'm going to learn about this, I'm going to see how it works, I'm going to intuit how it functions, and I'm going to use it as a model for my psychological schema. I'm going to develop the capacity to appreciate what I'm looking at, what I'm viewing. And so that is what I think people with ADHD have essentially done, is essentially they have done both. They have developed a protective narcissism, which is in some sense, I think, even an offshoot of essentially modeling their psyche over a kind of borderline template, but they don't operate it like a borderline. They don't use the projective mechanics, but they are capable of doing that. But they are analytically capable of doing it. And this means that they can't actually have their own conduit, their own motivational sequential flow. And I mean, I did somewhat intelligently talk about ADHD when I was talking about how I think it should be treated therapeutically, or how I could see it being healed. Um, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I remember giving a particular example of the that you would have to. I created like a thought experiment. It was almost like a kind of, I mean, a slight adaptation of dialectical behavior therapy, um, or I mean, I would see it in the same vogue as that sort of treatment, um, where essentially it would be a form of training. It would be a form of essentially, it's kind of like a weird sort of thought experiment. I'm you must forgive me. I'm remembering all this off the top of my head, but I think what you would have to do is you would have to get them to sit down and to do something in which, like, answer all these questions or do all of this work or something like that. And the point of the exercise is about rehabilitating the ability to track one's own internal motivation. And so the point is obviously they get distracted. They have ADHD. That's what they do. They get distracted, and they're not interested. They're not invested. The point of the exercise is for them to pretend that they are interested in the thing that they're not interested in, is to act as if they were interested in the thing. So the point is not for them to be tricked into actually being interested. The point is not for them to pretend or to trick themselves into actually being invested. No, no, no. That's not the point. The point is to develop the capacity of endurance against one's own inclination, in some sense. Because what I would say is actually lacking in the ADHD case is is in some sense it's a lack of confidence in the ability to have endurance, um, or it's they've never exercised the capacity of, in some sense, setting their intention. It's easier to give up on a train of thinking. It's easier to eject or to jettison a project, um, and to find a new priority or something like that, or to look for a more optimized. It's easier to search for something listlessly or aimlessly than it is to complete something. In some sense, there's a very low threshold of tolerance. Essentially, there's no ability to tolerate or to give patience to one's own. There's no capacity to provide patience to one's own. Um, yeah, I'm really butchering this because I realize what I'm saying now sounds very, very weak, and I did actually cover this topic much better when I originally went over it. But essentially, and in some sense, I do think that a lot of the ADHD, it has to do, in I would even say, with the lack of or the fear attached. Um, in some sense, I think in motivationally owning something that it becomes completed, that does not function in some sense, it's a fear of failure, but it's not in terms of the failure of the project itself. It's a failure of the motivation. In some sense, the motivation wasn't pure enough. So the product or the fruit of the project, or the work being done, will show that the narcissistic motivational component behind it is not perfect. It was imperfect. And so what you need in order to get over that is you need to be able to create in a mock way, in a mocked up way, an imaginative way, that I'm doing things not because I actually motivationally endorse them. I'm doing them as if I did motivationally endorse them. And am I able to create such a pretense? Am I able to concoct such a emulation of motivational endorsement? And when they see that they are capable of forging their own motivational endorsement, that is exactly what recursive circuitry is. That is exactly what it is to be able to enter your ego and leave the unconscious side of the mind, while at the same time being able to fundamentally, recursively, conscientiously review one's own subconscious. Because without the ego, it's impossible to, in some sense, to troubleshoot or to review, or to adjudicate over one's own subconscious. And in some sense, that's what I do see ADHD as being, somewhat of a manifestation quite similar to narcissism, although I do think that ontologically it comes because of the general zeitgeist, and it is actually modeled from borderline, but it functions more narcissistically. So, I mean, I would generally relate it to a light form of cluster B, although it probably clinically isn't necessarily that associated such. But anyway, I probably give a much better in the other recording where I deal with this. But anyway, okay, I guess that's all I'm going to be able to go over that's useful.